Hello and welcome. My name is Tibor Prievara, and I'm going to be your guide through the realms of gamification for the classroom in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So first of all, when discussing gamification, I think the first important concept to talk about would have to be digital well-being. Now, it's a hazy and quite many-faceted concept, but there are certain ideas central to it that could be distilled just by looking at the definitions that abound online. So we could quote the conscious use of technology as a recurring theme, crafting and maintaining a healthy relationship with technology, and helping communities raise their potential in an attempt to decrease stress and frustration. Now, how does it concern us? If you would like to see what it means for us teachers and how to behave, what to do in the classroom, these are the things that we could quote. Safety, creativity, balance, control, freedom, and the least possible amount of anxiety or stress. Now, how do we work around that? The problem is that our task, what we have to do, supposed to do in the classroom in order to be successful, have changed significantly in the past 25, 30 years. Now, as Caperton and Papert quotes, success in the slowly changing world of the past centuries came from being able to do well what you were taught to do. Success in the rapidly changing world of the future depends on not being able to do well what you were not taught to do. Now, this is quite a challenge, obviously, and we should really care about and worry and try to work out what classroom techniques, methodologies, practices could be introduced in order to achieve this goal. Now, obviously, there is a data-driven research base for that. Now, the details of this will be found in the accompanying booklet, but here let's just quote this huge meta study that does try to comprehend and help educators and education leaders in order to introduce certain things or not in their classroom practices. Now, there are three basic concepts along which all the studies that are related to the concepts on the left have been measured. The first is average cost, which means how expensive it is to introduce these things. The second one is evidence security, how secure and reliable the evidence pointing that direction is. And finally, and this is I think was the most important and interesting one for us, would be months impact. It means if you introduce these ideas like reading comprehension strategies, feedback, collaborative learning, mastery learning, or one-to-one tuition, this on the right hand side will show in terms of months of learning progress gained through the introduction of that concept in terms of one school year. So this means, in a nutshell, that if you introduce successfully feedback mechanisms in your school or your classroom, it's going to cost you very little and is going to be safely certain to succeed based on evidence, and is going to add to your school year 8 months of learning progress per year. Now, this is quite an astonishing find, is it? Because if you consider just by introducing varied, interesting, meaningful feedback mechanisms into your teaching profession, you can almost double the school's impact in our students' lives. So this is something I think important to take away. And now if you look at the next slide, you see what successful schools might look like. Obviously, these concepts I think we mostly agree on. There should be a clear goal, there should be a challenge, there should be clear rules, interactivity, a safe and reliable environment, varied feedback mechanisms just like the ones we saw, quantifiable outcome, and an emotional reaction. I think it could be hardly argued that all these concepts would be essential and central to the successful schools of the 21st century, except that this definition and these criteria are not about schools at all. So let's see where they come from. They come from a book called Play to Learn, which describes the basic concepts of gamification. As we saw, goal, challenge, rules, interactivity, environment, feedback mechanisms, quantifiable outcome, and an emotional reaction. So this means that there is quite considerable overlap of ideas in terms of game design and educational practices. Let's look at these in some detail in the next slide. So goal, of course, is in games, it's called when you play, but you introduce something that you want to achieve, a goal. So these provide a clear outcome and a delineation of completion. So you know when the game starts, when the game ends, when you win, when you lose, and what you have to do. So it's a very clear process that is clear to all people involved. All right. Now there should be a challenge. Of course, if the challenge is too big, then the game is going to be frustrating. If the challenge is non-existent, then it's going to be very boring. In terms of education, if you challenge your students too much and you give them very hard tasks that they are not able to do, that is beyond their competence, obviously they would not be able to do that and would be frustrated. If it's really boring, really easy, then they will lose interest because there is nothing interesting for them about it. Interestingly, however, if you come to think of it, no video game has ever been published and marketed saying it's easy. We just buy this game and there will be no challenges at all. However, when I think back upon my school days, I quite often heard teachers come into the classroom saying, now the next topic that we're going to study is really easy, so you don't have to worry about it. I think the essential conceptual difference here is that students do want to be challenged. Challenge is not a problem. The form of the challenge and the graded difficulty of the exercises and things, activities they have to do is the key. Now there are rules. So the more reliable these rules are, the clearer the structure, the clearer the game. Anything the students cannot prepare for. We have something in Hungary called an oral test. So when you have to just stand up and talk about the previous day's topics to the teacher, who's going to ask you questions, all impromptu, so the teacher just points at you and then you have to be on top and you have to bring your A game. Now this is highly unreliable, very, very stressful for students, plus it doesn't give them the chance of success, and there's always this looming danger of them being asked to talk about something on the spot without being able to prepare. Now I do this a lot, but I always tell students in advance, giving them ample opportunity to prepare and practice. I think it's hard enough as it is. Interactivity. Now, very often you still find teachers and the fount of knowledge who's going to talk through the lesson with students expected to take notes, hand in their notes, which might be graded or not graded or given feedback by the teacher. Now here, if you have interactivity in the center, I think it's going to be very important. If you teach someone how to play football once, after all the trainings and all the theoretical background information, you need to have these kids kick a ball. Now, game environment, it has to be safe, it has to be a self-contained space with its norms, with its clear rules and challenges. Feedback mechanisms we talked about, they're very important, and this is going to be at the very center of the next part of this presentation. And there should be a quantifiable outcome which students are presented with throughout. If you think of any game, you realize that as soon as you start the game, there is instant feedback. So you gather points as you move on, you get gold, you get some sort of result. So there is a very important part of it, which is the short-term immediate feedback. Now, you have mid-level or mid-term feedback as well. You can win and gain access to the next level. And finally, there is a long-term goal that you have to reach, which is going to be, I don't know, winning the boss fight at the end of the game. And finally, there should be an emotional reaction. Translated into classroom practices, I think it simply means that students have to be aware why what you're trying to teach them or what they're supposed to learn is important to learn. Now, based on all this, we're going to look at the definition of gamification in the second part of this presentation with some very clear-cut guidance and go step-by-step approaches as to how you can implement it in your classroom.